This is Sherlock Holmes and the Ashes of the Oracle, written by Barrel Coops.
Chapter 1. The Final Prophecy. It was nearing the end of March when I found Sherlock Holmes standing at the window of our Baker Street lodgings, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes narrowed on the mist-drenched rooftops of Marylebone. The morning fog had rolled in thick and low, clinging to chimneys and horse carts alike, casting the world into a pale and wavering twilight despite the hour. "Watson," he said without turning, "have you ever attended a séance?" I looked up from the morning paper, which held little interest beyond a column on the late winter flu. "I haven't, nor do I intend to. I leave the summoning of the dead to widows and playwrights." Holmes allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Then we're both in unfamiliar territory." He produced a letter from the mantel. The envelope was fine cream stock, but the handwriting inside was hurried, the sort that suggested a man writing while pacing. "Open quote, Mr. Holmes. There has been a death, sudden, inexplicable, and, if I may say so, surrounded by circumstances that defy conventional inquiry. The deceased was Madame Zuleika, the famed spiritualist, who collapsed mid-utterance during a public séance. Poison is suspected, yet there were no drinks. Foul play is feared, yet no one moved. It occurred last evening at 7 Belgrave Crescent. Scotland Yard has been alerted, but you will not be unwelcome. I implore your attention. Sir Hugo Bancroft." Close quote. I recognised the name. Sir Hugo Bancroft was a minor baronet and former colonial attaché, now more famously known for bankrolling the inner circle of London's occult societies, a benefactor of mediums, mesmerists, and self-styled prophets. "Are we to be investigators of ghosts now?" I asked dryly, setting aside the paper. Holmes turned. "Of ghosts, no, but of theatrics gone awry, most certainly. Come, Watson, let us see what nonsense breeds murder this week." The Bancroft townhouse stood at the top of a private crescent in Belgravia, its facade of clean white stone marred only by a window still fogged from the inside. A brougham was stationed nearby, and 2 constables lingered at the foot of the steps, speaking in low voices. Sir Hugo himself greeted us at the door, a portly man with a flushed face, his moustache slicked with the shine of a man who had been pulling at it in distress. His dinner jacket was still rumpled from the night before. "You came. Thank God." He ushered us in hastily, past gaslit corridors lined with heavy velvet drapes, and into a grand parlour now rendered gloomy by drawn blinds and the oppressive silence that followed catastrophe. "She died here," Sir Hugo said, gesturing toward a circle of high-backed chairs arranged around a low table. Atop it sat the remnants of the séance, a glass orb, cracked and cloudy, a silver bell, and a deck of ornate tarot cards, their edges scorched as if kissed by flame. "She was in the midst of a communication," he continued, lowering his voice. "Said she was in touch with a boy, my late son, Edward. Then she froze, gave a kind of choking sound and collapsed. No scream, no struggle." Holmes moved forward, already taking in the layout of the room. He passed a hand lightly over the table and stooped to examine something beneath it. "Who else was present?" he asked. 8 of us," Sir Hugo said. "Myself, Professor Beckwith, staunch skeptic, Lady Clara Belgrave, Miss Templeton, Zuleika's assistant, a man named Valerius, another medium, and," he hesitated, "a child, a mute boy who accompanied her everywhere. I believe she called him Eli." Holmes rose, holding up a scrap of blackened paper. "This was wedged under the leg of the table, near the fireplace," he murmured. "Recently burned. Can you recall anyone tending the fire?" "No one touched it. The room was warm already." Holmes handed me the fragment. "Only a few words survived the charring. Open quote. And when the veil is lifted, the second flame shall..." Close quote. I pocketed it carefully. The body had already been removed, but Holmes requested access to Madame Zuleika's quarters upstairs. Her suite was small but elaborate, draped in silks and incense-heavy. On the dressing table stood a silver-backed brush beside a series of coded notebooks bound in black leather, their pages filled with symbols I could make no immediate sense of, stars, triangles, ciphered text. Holmes leafed through one and stopped at a page near the centre. "This is not spiritualism," he murmured. "This is structure. Look at the margins, notations, angles. These are not random visions, Watson. This is a constructed narrative." "What sort of person constructs prophecy? The sort who knows how profitable it is to control belief." Back downstairs, Inspector Lestrade had arrived, his expression already tight with annoyance at Holmes's presence. "Thought I'd find you nosing around," he said, brushing past us into the séance room. "Bodies at St. Bart's. Initial opinion, cardiac failure. No outward signs of trauma." "Then she was not poisoned?" "We don't know that yet." Lestrade frowned. "There's a possibility the poison was inhaled, vapor form. I've sent for tests." Holmes tapped the table. "The scorched cards, the crystal orb. I suspect the murder weapon was not a poison but a belief, cleverly staged." Lestrade sighed. "You'll be telling me next she was frightened to death." Holmes gave him a half smile. "Unlikely, but perhaps she frightened herself to death trying to scare others. Tell me, has the assistant been interviewed?" Lestrade shook his head. "Gone. Disappeared before we arrived." That, I knew, was as good as a flare in the night for Holmes. We returned that evening, this time under the pretense of revisiting the scene. Holmes insisted on reenacting the seating arrangement and lighting conditions. Gas lamps were turned low. We took our places in the chairs while Holmes crouched at the table. He examined the underside of the table once more, running his hands along the inner edges. "False panel," he murmured. "Here." He pressed something. With a quiet pop, a hidden compartment released, revealing a thin glass phial cracked at the neck and an ash-like residue. I thought so. She released it herself. The vapor likely induced hallucinogenic symptoms. But something, he paused, something else caused her to panic. He picked up the bell and rang it once. A clear note echoed, then a second time. The third time the bell didn't sound at all. Holmes held it up. Inside, the clapper had been sealed with wax, not melted, but charred. She believed she was hearing things, he said softly, but in truth she was hearing nothing at all. A silence that replaced sound. That is far more terrifying than any ghost. He pointed at the cracked orb. Deliberately fractured, prismatic glass. When the vapor filled the room and the gas lights reflected through this, it would have appeared as a halo or a flame. "And the card burns?" I asked. "Chemical edges, touched with potassium nitrate, perhaps. A warm surface or static would ignite them faintly, not enough to damage the table, but enough to inspire fear." "Then she engineered her own death?" Holmes looked toward the window, where fog curled like ghosts against the glass. "No. She engineered a performance. Someone else rewrote the final act." The next morning, Holmes received a telegram. The partial translation of the notebook had arrived from a linguist in Whitechapel. He opened it without ceremony and read aloud. Open quote, "2 deaths entwined shall mark the veil's undoing. 1 born of ashes. 1 swallowed by silence. The gate opens not with fire, but with repetition." Close quote. Holmes folded the note, his eyes unreadable. "She left us a warning," he said, "but also a plan. We must determine if this is prophecy or simply misdirection masked in poetry." "What now?" "We find the assistant, Miss Templeton, and the boy." He turned back to the fireplace where the final scrap of prophecy had smouldered. "There is more than belief at work here, Watson. There is intent, and whoever orchestrated this death is not finished." Chapter 2. Smoke and Mirrors. It was just past 9 o'clock the following morning when we returned to Belgrave Crescent, the heavy fog of the prior day now burnt away by a pale but determined sun. The facade of Sir Hugo Bancroft's townhouse looked no less grim in daylight. If anything, the clarity revealed the lines of neglect and disrepair beneath its fashionable stonework. The brass knocker was dull, the hedges overgrown, and the curtains drawn tight as if to keep the living from prying into the secrets of the dead. Inside, the parlour had been preserved at Holmes's request. No item had been removed, not even the scorched tarot cards or the cracked crystal orb still resting in the centre of the séance table like the eye of some long-dead god. Lestrade greeted us in a sour mood, rubbing the back of his neck as though the act might rid him of the headache this case promised. "Morning, gentlemen. You'll be pleased to know we've identified the toxin. Rare, very rare. Extract of Virola theodora, some kind of South American tree sap used in tribal rituals, hallucinogenic, fatal in the right dose." Holmes crouched beside the séance table, ignoring him entirely, his attention fixed on the wooden structure's underside. He pressed gently along the rim, fingers tracing its edge like a pianist seeking the first chord of a sonata. "And you're certain it was in her tea?" I asked. Lestrade nodded. "Traces found in the cup. and residue on her lips, according to Bart's. No one else drank from it? No, only her. That's the strange part. She prepared the cup herself. Her assistant was the only one who touched it prior, but the girl's vanished. Her name's Templeton. Ruby Templeton. Holmes murmured something inaudible and, with a sharp click, pressed a concealed latch on the underside of the table. A small panel sprang open, revealing a narrow compartment. From it, he withdrew a thin black notebook, bound in soft calfskin and sealed with a red ribbon now brittle with age. "Not part of any theatrical prop," he muttered. "Why hide it?" He laid it on the table and untied the ribbon. The pages within were thick, hand-cut vellum covered not in handwriting, but in symbols, arcane diagrams, celestial charts, and phrases written in a spidery cipher that danced along the margins like insects caught mid-crawl. Watson peered over his shoulder. "Do you recognize the script?" "Not yet, but it's not nonsense. There's consistency here, a system." Holmes turned a page. A blend of Enochian, Greek, and some kind of personal shorthand. It's either an elaborate distraction or a message designed for a very specific recipient. He closed the book with care and passed it to me. "Take it to Mr. Grinlow in Whitechapel," he said. "He assisted me during the Stuttgart affair. Specialist in cryptology, partial to star maps and absinthe. Tell him to prioritize this over his sins." "You're not coming?" "There are living minds I wish to interrogate before they dissolve into memory." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "I'll require your witness list. I intend to question every one of them." While I made for Whitechapel with the strange notebook tucked safely in my coat, Holmes remained behind to conduct his interviews. The first guest to return at Holmes's request was Professor Charles Beckwith, a gaunt man with prominent cheekbones and a trimmed silver beard, dressed in a black frock coat so sharply pressed it seemed starched with contempt. A professor of metaphysics at King's College, Beckwith made no effort to hide his disdain for the late Madame Zuleika. "I came only to witness the charade," he said, adjusting his gloves as if the very air of the room offended him. "I've made it my business to expose spiritualist trickery, fraudulence disguised as comfort, sold to the gullible." "And yet," Holmes said evenly, "you continued to fund her appearances at Bancroft's salons." Beckwith sniffed. "To observe and to document. My monograph on post-spiritualist hysteria is due to the Royal Society within the year. What better case study than the capital's most famed fraud?" "You didn't believe in her powers." "Powers? Sir, I've seen better illusions in tavern theatres. Bells on wires, gusts of wind through cleverly hidden pipes. Her act was a pantomime for those too weak to accept the finality of death." "Yet you remained silent last night as she died before your eyes." Beckwith bristled. "I was waiting for the curtain call." Holmes's gaze sharpened, but he said nothing more. Beckwith was dismissed, leaving the room colder than when he'd entered. The second visitor was Lady Clara Belgrave, a widow of some notoriety. Once a celebrated beauty in society pages, she now dressed in severe mourning blacks trimmed in violet. Her gloved hands trembled as she lowered herself into a chair. "I knew something was wrong the moment the candle sputtered," she whispered. "I felt cold. Not air, but dread, like someone had slipped a sheet of ice across my skin." "Did you witness anyone tampering with Madame Zuleika's tea?" "No, she kept it close. Ruby poured the water, but the rest, Zuleika insisted on handling it herself." "Were you aware of any threats made against her?" Lady Clara hesitated. "She received letters, sometimes after performances. She never showed them to me, but I saw her burning one once. The paper was thick, expensive. She held it with tongs, like it disgusted her." "Do you remember the sender's name?" "I don't. No, but I remember a scent. The letter smelled of smoke. Not tobacco, something harsher, like tar." Holmes nodded slowly. "Thank you. That will be all, Lady Clara." She paused before leaving. "Do you think she truly crossed over?" Holmes's voice was gentler than I expected. "No, my lady, but I believe someone wished her to believe she had." Next came the great Valerius, the only man in London who wore a velvet turban without irony. Dressed in saffron robes and trailing the faint scent of cloves, he swept into the room with theatrical flair, only to falter slightly when he saw the empty séance table. "You should know," he said, taking the offered seat. "I had no quarrel with Zuleika. Our rivalry was mutual and professional. You've competed for the same circles. We've danced around each other for years. She had the drawing rooms, I had the theatres, but we understood the trade, and she was, in her own way, a visionary. Did she know she was dying? Valerius's dark eyes flickered. She may have suspected. Her visions had become erratic. She claimed to see things outside time. Holmes tilted his head. What sort of things? Movements, patterns. She said she was being watched, not by spirits, but by something she couldn't name. She called it the veil with eyes. A hallucination? Perhaps. But she believed it. She told me last week, the dead are trying to speak, Valerius, but not to us. Holmes steepled his fingers. Did she mention a prophecy? Valerius frowned. She stopped using that word, said it had been tainted. By whom? She wouldn't say. Holmes dismissed him, but his mind was already elsewhere. Late that afternoon, I returned from Whitechapel to find Holmes once more beneath the séance table, now armed with a jeweller's lens and a small lamp. He had dismantled part of the underside and was inspecting what looked like copper filaments wired into the table's edge. A rudimentary induction device, he said as I entered. It would have allowed her to trigger vibrations through the surface, subtle enough to pass for spectral contact. And here, see this groove? It housed a pressurized ampoule, most likely the delivery system for the inhaled toxin. She poisoned herself? I asked, astonished. She released the substance herself. That's not the same thing. I handed him the note from Grinlow. It was short. Open quote, partial decoding successful. Symbols align with lunar alchemy and Zoroastrian star mapping. Phrase repeated throughout, 2 deaths for the veil to lift. The first by flame, the second by silence. Close quote. Holmes read it twice, then tossed it into the fireplace without ceremony. We're being told a story, he murmured, but the narrator's voice has been altered. As night fell, he rose, dusted off his knees, and pulled the velvet curtain over the cracked orb. The séance was an illusion, a trap dressed in robes of mysticism. But the poison, the notebook, the coded prophecy, those are not stagecraft. He looked to me, the room flickering with the last light of day. This is no longer a question of who killed Madame Zuleika. He paused. It is a question of why she agreed to die. Chapter 3. The Oracle's Circle. It was a grey Thursday when Holmes and I boarded a hansom bound for Bloomsbury, where the elusive society known as the Oracle's Circle maintained its so-called Hall of Inquiry. A small brass plate on the door at number 4 Half Wellwood Street bore only a single symbol, an Ouroboros coiled around a compass rose, an emblem as cryptic as the organisation it signified. From the outside, the building resembled any other in that academic quarter, soot-darkened brick, narrow windows, and ivy snaking up the facade like veins on a cadaver. But inside, the air shifted. It was as if we had passed through a veil into a place out of joint with time. The entrance hall was shrouded in muted velvet curtains, the colour of dried blood, and the smell of musty parchment mixed with clove smoke lingered in the air like a whisper. Somewhere deep within, a grandfather clock ticked a rhythm slower than natural. "Would you care to tell me," I said as we waited for someone to answer our ring, "why we are now consorting with occultists?" Holmes's eyes flicked to me, sharp with humour. "We're not consorting, Watson. We're interrogating, and the difference lies in who asks the questions." A woman appeared at the far end of the hallway. She was perhaps 30, dressed in an academic's robes with her auburn hair pinned into a loose chignon. Her features were pale but not unkind. "You are expected," she said, and with no further invitation turned and led us into the building. The interior was a strange hybrid of science and superstition. We passed a long corridor lined with glass cases containing relics, a shriveled monkey's paw labelled Pazuzu's hand, a 3-armed abacus claimed to divine the outcome of elections, and a taxidermied raven perched atop a phrenology bust. At one point, we passed a room where 3 men in scholars' gowns were solemnly observing a pendulum suspended over a map of Europe. The woman led us to a circular chamber at the heart of the building. It was domed like an observatory, with angled windows at the apex letting in shafts of fog-filtered light. In the centre of the room stood a crescent-shaped desk fashioned from polished mahogany, behind which sat a gaunt, white-haired man in a wine-coloured robe. Professor Elgin Drebb. He did not rise when we entered, nor did he offer a hand. Instead, he gestured to the 2 empty chairs across from him. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, the Circle welcomes inquiry, and your reputations precede you. Holmes remained standing. Let us not mistake civility for candour. You know why I'm here. Dreb's eyes glittered like cut glass. You wish to know about Zuleika. I wish to know why you expelled her, and what she was on the verge of revealing. Dreb allowed himself a long pause, as though weighing how much truth could be safely extracted without compromising the integrity of a performance. She was brilliant, he said at last. Far more than a conjurer. She believed, and I use the word carefully, in the intersection between metaphysical suggestion and scientific inevitability. What some call prophecy, she called probability refined by ritual. And it frightened the others. Because it worked? Because it nearly did. Holmes's mouth twisted. Your society traffics in illusions dressed as insight. Why draw the line there? Because illusion, Dreb said quietly, depends on the consent of the observer. Zuleika sought something absolute, something that bypassed belief entirely, and belief is the cornerstone of our influence. I leaned forward. You're saying she discovered something real? No, Dreb corrected me. I'm saying she discovered something repeatable. Holmes pulled the coded notebook from his coat. Then you'll be familiar with this. Dreb regarded it with something approaching reverence. The Codex Nocturna, her final volume, I thought it destroyed. Holmes placed it on the desk. It wasn't. It was hidden beneath the séance table, and it contains references to a final vision, a kind of event or revelation. Dreb nodded solemnly. She spoke of it often in her final months. She believed she had mapped a moment, a convergence, she called it, when the psychological and the temporal would briefly align. Not merely a premonition, but a breach. She claimed she could predict the conditions of a decision before it was made. Not the decision itself? No, that would be determinism. But she believed in the pattern of tension, that a man faced with a choice produces a unique psychological resonance. By studying those resonances across time, she believed she could hear the conditions of coming crises. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And you cast her out for that? She wanted to reveal it, publicly. She wanted to build a machine, a kind of psychological seismograph, something that could be used to detect these precursors. The council feared she would dismantle our entire premise. Holmes lifted an eyebrow. That spiritualism is sacred? That spiritualism, Dreb said coolly, sells. There was a long silence. Did you kill her? Holmes asked simply. Dreb smiled thinly. If I had wanted her silenced, I would have published a rebuttal, not a eulogy. After a long and uneasy pause, Dreb rose and crossed the room to a locked cabinet. From within, he withdrew a folio of aged vellum sheets bound in crimson twine. I am giving you this in confidence, Mr. Holmes, not because I trust you, but because I believe you can keep what you do not understand out of the wrong hands. He handed Holmes the folio. These are her last lectures, never published. They contain fragments of the pattern she was building, what she called the veil equation. I cannot tell you what it means, but I believe someone else can. Holmes opened it. The first page was covered in numbers arranged in spirals with strange symbols woven between them like runes. She was writing for someone else, Holmes murmured. This wasn't meant for mass consumption. No, Dreb agreed. She said only one man would ever be able to finish the equation. Who? She wouldn't say. Holmes closed the folio and turned to leave. But Dreb's final words followed us out. She believed in truth, Mr. Holmes, but she forgot that some truths are weapons. Back in the hansom, as we rattled through the half-washed streets of Bloomsbury, Holmes examined the folio again. Rain had begun to fall, light and sharp like needles on glass. She was on the verge of something, he said, but she knew it would be stolen the moment she revealed it. That's why the performance had to fail. Why she had to die on her own terms. To protect the idea? No, to scatter the pieces so no one could claim the whole. He tapped the folio lightly. She left us a puzzle, Watson, but it's also a warning. What of the prophecy? I asked. The veil, the two deaths, what does it mean? Holmes's voice was distant, even as he stared out at the sodden city. If I had to guess, he said, I'd say the first death was a demonstration. And the second, Holmes turned to me, a challenge. Chapter 4, Death Foretold. The following morning dawned with a bleached and pitiless sky, the colour of bone. Fog still clung to the river, but over Baker Street a pale clarity had broken through. a light that revealed the city without compassion. The cobblestones, the chimney smoke, the worn expressions of market traders all appeared strangely drained of meaning, like reflections of lives already lived. Inside our sitting room, Holmes had turned the table into a war council. Pinned to the wallpaper with brass tacks were the burned letter fragment, several scraps of the decoded Codex Nocturna, and now 6 envelopes arranged like the petals of a withered flower. Each bore the same looping hand. Each had been addressed by Zuleika. "She sent them 3 days before her death," I said, tapping my notes. "All to séance guests, delivered by hand or by private courier." "Read them," Holmes said without looking up. He was bent over the fireplace, comparing ashes with fresh blotting paper. I took the first. Open quote. "To Lady Clara, there are embers in your grief, my dear, but beware the fire that pretends to warm. It may yet consume what is left of your peace." Zek II, addressed to Professor Beckwith, open quote, "Charles, your mirror mocks you. You see not the world, but your own disdain reflected back. One day soon it will betray you." Close quote. A third, to the great Valerius, open quote, "You play with smoke and think it cannot choke, but smoke is what's left when something dear is already lost." Close quote. There were 3 more, all variations on the same tone, warnings, allegories, half-prophecies, each with a single underlined phrase, fire from within or betrayal in mirrors. Holmes rose, a smudge of soot on his sleeve. "She wrote them all," he said. "Same ink, same pen pressure, but look at this." He held up the burned scrap from the séance table, open quote, "And when the veil is lifted, the second flame shall," close quote. The fragment was from the same paper stock, but not the same pen. Ink flows differently, wetter, more pressure. "So she didn't burn her own words?" I asked. "Or someone burned her words and inserted others in their place?" He crossed to the window, where a pale beam of sun had forced its way through the gauze of smoke outside. "She knew she was being manipulated, Watson. These letters are both warnings and records. Look again, each is phrased like a riddle, but also like a confession. What if she wasn't merely warning them? What then? What if she was accusing them?" Holmes departed shortly thereafter, leaving me with instructions to verify the postmarks and delivery times for all 6 letters. Meanwhile, he made his way south of the river, to an address in Lambeth where the air reeked of oil, ink, and counterfeit coin. The place was unmarked, wedged between a cooper's yard and a shop that sold second-hand corsets. Inside, the scent of acid and vellum was overpowering, and the walls were crowded with copper plates and steel nibs. This was the lair of Milo Varn, a forger so skilled he once replicated a Danish banknote while drunk and upside down, a feat Holmes considered almost admirable, in the way treason is almost romantic. Varn was a wiry man with breath like camphor and fingers stained the colour of midnight. He peered over his pince-nez as Holmes handed him a photocopy of the séance invitation Zuleika had supposedly received. "Fine paper," he muttered. "Good ink, but not hers." "You're certain? Too sure?" He snapped his fingers. "Stroke pattern's off. See this loop in the Z? Too crisp, too shallow. It's mimicking flourish, not following it." Holmes leaned closer. "Could you reproduce this forgery?" Varn grinned, exposing yellow teeth. "I could reproduce it better, but more to the point, I've seen it before." "You've forged this hand?" "Not me, but there's a chap in Holborn, names himself Jonas Pritch, real name's God knows what, used to do invitations for a charlatan preacher. When that folded, he moved into, let's say, less divine correspondence." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And who hired him?" Varn hesitated, suddenly cagey. "I'll need a name." "I'll need a guarantee," Varn said. "No raids, no visitations. I'm an artist, not a suspect." "You're a criminal," Holmes replied calmly, "but a useful one. You'll have your silence so long as you earn it." Varn sighed, scratched at his scalp, then muttered, "Valerius, that preening mystic peacock, had Pritch forged 3 notes last month. One went to Zuleika." When Holmes returned, he found me surrounded by the results of my errands, stamps, postmarks, and courier logs. I looked up from a delivery slip with raised brows. 2 of the letters, I said, were never delivered. No one at the residence recalls seeing a courier. "Which ones?" "Beckwith's and Valerius's." Holmes allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. "Because they were never meant to be read, only mentioned. Zuleika's death was staged to resemble prophecy, and prophecy requires an audience who already believe." He crossed to the fireplace again and threw in another piece of the jigsaw. The prophecy line from the Codex has also been fully decoded. Grinlow wired this. He handed me the slip, open quote, 1 death opens the gate. 2 shall silence the veil forever. The second must reflect the first. Ash to echo ash, close quote. I felt a chill. 2 deaths? Holmes nodded. The first was theatrical, a death by arrangement, but the second was meant to cement the illusion. A second real death? I fear so, and it may already be underway. We returned to Belgrave Crescent that evening. Sir Hugo had been reluctant to open the house again, but Holmes's manner did not allow for hesitation. The séance chamber had not been touched since our first visit. The table still marked, the scorched cards still curled like autumn leaves left too long in the fire. Holmes moved immediately to the bookshelves at the far end of the room. His fingers danced along the spines until he found what he sought, a slim, leather-bound volume titled Ether and Memory. He opened it. Hollowed inside was a small metal canister. Inside the canister, a folded note. Holmes read it aloud. Open quote, To the one who finds this, I fear I'm not the author of my own end. My vision has been rewritten by a second hand. If I am to die, let it be for the truth, not for theatre. The veil must not be pierced. Z. Close quote. There was silence. Outside, the city had grown darker. A storm threatened to break. She knew, Holmes whispered. She knew someone had taken control of her narrative. She was trying to leave breadcrumbs. But who was the second hand? Holmes looked at the prophecy line again. Open quote. The second must reflect the first. Close quote. Not oppose it, he said. Reflect it. Meaning? Meaning the second victim won't just die. They'll die in imitation, as if mirroring Zuleika's final moments. The same symbols, the same hallmarks, a ritual echo. I stared at the flickering candlelight, uneasy. But who would want to mirror a murder? Holmes's expression was grim. Someone who believes that repetition isn't just pattern, but power. That night Holmes worked late, his violin silent, his mind aflame. We had begun the case expecting trickery, poison and stagecraft, but what now emerged was something more disturbing. Not merely a plan to kill, but a plan to convince. To make witnesses believe that death obeyed prophecy. That time bent to symbol. That superstition was destiny. And now as Holmes studied the prophecy again under the flickering gaslight, I saw something in his face I rarely saw. Concern. True human concern. Not for himself, but for someone still alive. Someone at risk of becoming the second page in a book they never meant to open. Chapter 5. The Fire in the Fog. It began, as such things often do in London, with fog, a heavy copper-tasting veil that pressed down on the city like a wet shroud. From our lodgings at Baker Street, the world looked half erased, outlines blunted, lamplights scattered like dying stars. The cold had returned with it, sharp enough to creep through closed windows, and it was into this murk that a sharp knock rang out at the door just before 6. It was Lestrade. He stood dripping on the threshold, his hat clutched in one gloved hand, the other smudged with soot. Another one, he said. Holmes looked up from the folio of Zuleika's unpublished notes. Where? Belgravia, conservatory at Lord Belgrave's estate. You'll want to see it for yourself. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. Lord Belgrave's estate sat in Lowndes Square, flanked by stately facades and gas lamps that hissed into the murk like tired sentries. The household was in disarray. Servants milled near the gates, whispering furiously, and one poor footman had fainted outright and been draped across the garden bench like a discarded cravat. Inside, the conservatory smelled of scorched glass and metal, not fire, precisely, but after fire. Something chemical, something wrong. The glass panels of the conservatory ceiling remained intact, but one section bore a circular scorch mark, black and oily, etched directly into the pane above the central mosaic. In the centre of the tiled floor lay what was once Lord Cedric Belgrave. He had not merely died, he had been undone. His body had collapsed inward, skin charred but not burst, his clothing untouched except for the shirt which had burned straight through at the chest. His expression, locked in what little remained of it, was one of astonishment, as though he had glimpsed something extraordinary in his final breath. Holmes crouched without speaking, studying the scene. No signs of external flame, Lestrade muttered. No open fire. No lamps knocked over. No accelerant residue. Because there was no fire, Holmes said. Not in the ordinary sense. He pointed to the floor tiles. Notice anything? Other than the corpse? The pattern, slightly offset. That tile beneath his left shoulder, not original, cracked differently. Lestrade bent over. You think something was beneath the floor? Holmes turned his gaze upward. Not beneath. Above. He stood and crossed to the far wall where a rosewood cabinet stood against the brick. Inside, gardening tools and gloves. Beneath them, a sealed tin labelled cymoxyl, a powerful oxidizing agent. Holmes held it up. Perfectly stable in isolation, but mix it with hydrochloride vapor. Lestrade blinked. What happens? You get combustion. Internal. Inhaled. A slow chemical burn from inside the lungs outward. You're saying he breathed himself to death? In a manner of speaking. An hour later, Holmes summoned me from Baker Street. I arrived to find the room already strewn with paper. Not our own for once, but Valerius's. The magician's rooms had been searched under warrant. Among the silks, bells, and smokesticks had been a trunk marked Stage Effects Private. Inside were notebooks, diagrams of stage setups, and something far stranger. A ledger. Oracle debt, I read aloud from the embossed cover. What does it mean? Holmes tapped the list. Names, dates, payments, and symbols, the same as in Zuleika's codex. I studied it. Some of the names were crossed out. Zuleika, Belgrave. So this isn't a ledger of money, I said slowly. No, it's a ledger of promises. Debts owed not in coin but influence. Secrets. Loyalty. And when those promises were broken? Holmes pointed to Zuleika's name. Next to it was a crude flame-like symbol. Next to Belgrave's, a mirror cracked in two. The same imagery she used in her letters. So Valerius was punishing them? I asked, or carrying out the prophecy. Holmes stood and moved to the fire. Zuleika planned a death, but someone else planned a consequence, a theatrical echo, to fulfill the pattern. Why Belgrave? Because he broke with Zuleika weeks before her death, cut off funding, claimed she was mentally unstable. And Valerius? Holmes opened a second notebook. It contained a layout of a theatre stage, but the notations were bizarre. Resonant frequencies, hollow vox, mirrored flame. Valerius wasn't just an illusionist, Holmes said. He was attempting something else, something far more dangerous. He tapped the words mirrored flame again. A hallucinogenic illusion, designed not just to fool the eye, but to transform the memory. We returned to the conservatory that evening. The body had been removed. Only the sigil remained, etched into the glass above. Holmes climbed a stepladder and examined it with a magnifier. It's not smoke, he called down. It's silver nitrate, spread thin with a cloth, then chemically scorched. Why? To mark the ritual, a signature. He descended and crossed to the tile again, removing it with a knife. Beneath it, a hidden recess containing a small mesh pouch. Inside, crystals coated in a fine dust. Oxidizing agent and a vapor compound, Holmes said. Timed release, likely activated by heat or motion. He turned to Lestrade. Belgrave was meant to die. This was not revenge. It was choreography. That night, Holmes locked himself away for hours. I heard no violin, only the occasional scrape of a chair, the soft click of glass, the rasp of pen on paper. He emerged near midnight with red-rimmed eyes and a faint chemical scent on his cuffs. I've isolated the vapor, he said. It's a blend of capsicum oil myristicin and a trace of silver nitrate. Inhaled, it produces a vivid hallucination. The victim believes they are burning. But they aren't? They are. The hallucination provokes panic, hyperventilation, then a delayed chemical ignition. The mind lights the match, but the lungs provide the fuel. And all this just to mirror Zuleika's death? Holmes opened the oracle ledger again and pointed. Because there's a third name. I read it aloud, Edreb. Next to it, a symbol of concentric spirals, a cracked lens. By morning, Holmes had the threads drawn together. Valerius had vanished, but his accounts had not. A transfer had been made to a warehouse near the river, registered under a shell company. Holmes and Lestrade moved at once. I remained behind, tasked with visiting Dreb at the Oracle Circle. He greeted me with a scholar's calm. I expected him, he said, not you. Holmes is following the machinery, I said. I've come for the intentions. Dreb motioned me to sit. She wanted to disassemble belief, he said. Not destroy it, just unbind it from its charlatans. You're on Valerius's list, I said. I know. You think he'll come for you? I think he already has. The mirror in my office cracked this morning for no reason. He showed me his hand, 2 fingers lightly burned. I found residue on my teacup, the same scent she described before she died. Why haven't you left? Because if this ends in ritual, Dreb said, then the only way to break it is to interrupt it. Holmes returned near dusk, soaked through and shivering slightly. The warehouse was empty, he said, but Valerius left a stage, curtains, lights, and in the centre, an empty chair, facing a mirror. Set for Dreb, set for himself. He collapsed into a chair. He believes he is the second death. I frowned. Why? Because to seal a prophecy, the author must die, and he thinks he's the one writing it now. We barely had time to change coats before the telegram arrived. Oracle's circle. Emergency. Come at once. Dreb Holmes was out the door before I'd stood up. Chapter 6. The Man Who Wasn't There. The fog had lifted by morning, but London remained no less opaque. The day's headlines had already begun to spin the mystery of Lord Belgrave's death into a myth. Spontaneous combustion in Belgravia. Ghosts of the séance strike again. The tabloids were drunk on occult speculation, and the rational few were quietly horrified by how swiftly fear made fools of the city's elite. Holmes, as ever, remained immune to such distractions. He sat in his armchair with Zuleika's ledger opened across his knees, his fingers tapping out a silent rhythm against the margins of the page. "There's one figure we haven't accounted for, Watson," he said at last, eyes never lifting. "The boy, the mute." "Eli?" I asked. "You think he's involved?" "I think he doesn't exist." I set down my teacup. "But we saw him. We saw a figure, a silent shadow. But not once did he speak. Not once did he respond to direct address, and Zuleika controlled access to him completely. You believe he was an invention?" "No, I believe he was a disguise." Holmes rose, crossing to his files, and pulled free a thin, yellowed envelope marked Sawyer's Troop. 4 years ago, I investigated the disappearance of a magician's assistant from a travelling illusionist guild. Sawyer's Troop was known for its human marionette act, small performers dressed and trained to mimic children. One in particular was gifted in disguise, a contortionist, a mimic, and a master of ventriloquism. Holmes pulled a faded photograph from the envelope. The man, or boy, in the image had sharp features and a delicate jawline, a mouth that gave nothing away, and eyes like obsidian pins. "His stage name," Holmes said, "was Ash." We set out at once for Zuleika's townhouse in Kensington, a narrow Georgian affair that looked more respectable than it deserved. The curtains had not been drawn back since her death, and a fine layer of dust coated the front step like ash. Lestrade had already secured the building, but Holmes requested the key under the pretext of closing the investigation into personal effects. The constable posted at the door barely looked up as we passed. Inside, the parlour had been preserved, the velvet chairs still facing the ghost of the séance table, the air still thick with the memory of incense and spilled fear. But Holmes ignored it entirely. He moved instead to the rear of the house, past the small library and dining room, until he reached a narrow hallway flanked by full-length mirrors. "Mirrors," he muttered, "always mirrors." He paused before the largest one and ran his fingers along the edges of the frame. Then, without warning, he pressed inward. There was a faint click. The mirror swung open like a door. Behind it, a passage descended into shadow. We lit lanterns and stepped into the dark. The air grew cooler and drier, like that of a crypt. The walls were lined with wood panels scored by age and grime, but they gave way to stone as we descended. At the bottom we found a narrow chamber, no larger than a pantry, and a single iron door. Holmes tried the handle. It turned. The door creaked open into a low-ceilinged room that might once have been a coal cellar. But now it had become something else entirely. The walls were painted black. The ceiling was strung with small lenses and glass prisms. A bench along one wall held rolls of film, paperweights, magnifiers, and a hand-cranked cinematograph, an early type, Edison style. 3 reels sat in a velvet-lined box beside it, each labelled in precise feminine script. I Mirror Room. 2. Ash Ritual. 3. Dreb 4th Jan. Holmes set up the machine and threaded the first reel. He produced a small projector lamp from his coat. I hadn't even noticed him packing it, and attached it to the wheel. "Shut the door, Watson," he said quietly. I did. The film began to play. Reel R. Mirror Room. The screen flickered to life against the far wall. At first the image was blurry, a single point of light resolving into a shape. A figure stood in a round room surrounded by mirrors, wearing a white robe with black stitching. He or she moved jerkily as though under water. The room pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat made visible. Then the figure turned, and the face was Zuleika's. She stood in silence, staring into a mirror. She mouthed words, no sound came, but written across the glass in grease paint was a phrase, open quote, "Who watches the seer?" Close quote. The film ended. Reel 2, Ash Ritual. This one began in darkness, a low flame ignited not in a hearth but on the floor. Symbols were drawn in ash across wooden boards. A figure entered, short, slight, draped in a hooded robe. He knelt. The ash was spread in a circle. He began to trace it with a fingertip, and then, horrifyingly, with his tongue. The film shook slightly, as though the camera operator flinched. The figure turned to the lens and grinned. Holmes stopped the reel. The room was silent. "That," he said, "is not a boy." Reel 3, Dreb 4th January. This footage was of a conversation. Zuleika sat with Professor Dreb in what appeared to be the same séance parlour. Her voice, faint and mechanical through the machine's speaker, was clipped and precise. Open quote, "They don't believe me, not even you." Close quote. Open quote, "Because you're trespassing beyond invention, you're trying to prove intuition." Close quote. Open quote, "Is that so dangerous?" Close quote. Open quote, "Only to those who rely on it being unpredictable." Close quote. Open quote, "Then we must finish the codex, before someone else does." Close quote. Holmes stopped the reel. "So," I said, "she was building something she feared others would complete. Something dangerous." "No," Holmes said, "she was building a system, and someone turned it into a ritual." He pointed to the ash ring from Reel 2. Zuleika mapped the psychological conditions of belief. Someone else used that map to recreate faith as performance. We searched the chamber further. On one wall, Holmes discovered a chart, a sprawling timeline of names, dates, and red threads. Belgrave, Valerius, Dreb, Zuleika herself. Each name was connected to a phrase: witness, participant, catalyst, medium. "This isn't a theory," Holmes murmured. "It's a script." "What do you mean?" "She wrote roles for all of them. The séance was only one scene. The rest, the letters, the deaths, were orchestrated. By her? Partly, but someone hijacked the ending." As we left the hidden chamber, Holmes paused by the mirror door and touched the inside with a gloved finger. There, faint but legible, were fingerprints. "Too large for Zuleika," he said. "Then Ash?" Holmes nodded. "I think our silent boy was the director all along." That night, back at Baker Street, Holmes laid out everything we had: the films, the ledger, the fingerprints, the ritual. "Ash," he said softly, "isn't just a conspirator. He's the continuation of Zuleika's vision, twisted into something she never intended." I frowned. "Why go to such lengths?" Holmes met my eyes. "To make belief into law, to shape behaviour through repetition. Imagine a world where prophecy can be faked so well, it becomes truth." A silence settled, then he stood. "We must find Ash." "How?" Holmes turned to the wall where the prophecy fragment still hung. Open quote, "One death oath opens the gate, two shall silence the veil forever." Close quote. "There's still one name uncrossed in the ledger," Holmes said. "One role unfulfilled." I followed his gaze. "Watson." And then he whispered, "Mine." Chapter 7. The Ashes Speak. The stars above London are seldom seen clearly, obscured more often by soot and smoke than by cloud. But on the rare occasion when the heavens open and allow a glimpse through the filth, even for a moment, they remind the city of something older, stranger, and not easily explained. Holmes, seated in his dressing gown, watched the window as if the night sky itself had become a suspect. "It's not a date," he murmured. "It's a conjunction." He rose and crossed to the bureau where he had spread out the last decoded scraps of Zuleika's Codex Nocturna, each pinned down by cufflinks and a jar of pipe tobacco. The symbols were arcane and maddening, spirals inside spirals, glyphs that mimicked the astronomical shorthand of almanacs, but bled into the visual language of prophecy. Watson leaned over the desk. "You've found a pattern?" "More than that," Holmes said. "I found a date and a location. But first, listen." He read aloud from the final passage, which had taken Grinlow in Whitechapel 2 full days and a bottle of absinthe to translate. Open quote. "When Saturn devours Venus, and Mercury stands silent at the eastern gate, the veil shall thin, the mirror shall no longer reflect, and the second truth will be made manifest by ash and flame." Close quote. Watson's brow furrowed. It reads like poetry. Holmes shook his head. It reads like ritual. But the references, Saturn and Venus in opposition, Mercury rising just before dawn, it's a real astronomical event. It occurs this week, 3 days from now, just before sunrise. He turned and plucked an invitation from the mantel. The Royal Academy of Occult Philosophy presents Science Beyond Sight, a lecture by Professor Elgin Drebb. 1 night only, free to the public. Doors open 10 p.m. She wrote the codex to warn him, Holmes said, and now he's walking into a ritual dressed as an academic presentation. That afternoon, Holmes and Watson parted ways. Holmes, in pursuit of the prophecy's deeper intention, turned his attention to Drebb's published writings and the astronomical records held at the British Museum. Watson, ever the soldier and the pragmatist, followed a more terrestrial trail. One of Valerius's suppliers, a theatrical outfitter named Gaspard, had a riverside warehouse in Limehouse. A few discreet inquiries led Watson to it. A narrow, crumbling structure perched at the edge of the Thames like an old drunk leaning too far over the embankment. Inside, the air was rank with mildew and alchemical vapour. Crates lined the walls, most marked as theatrical goods, fragile, but within them were rows of glass vials, powders, sealed pouches of ash, and small brass cylinders fitted with ignition coils, too precise to be props. A figure darted through the shadows as Watson entered. "Halt!" he barked, raising his revolver. The figure stumbled, collided with a crate, and fell. A boy no older than 20, wiry and soot-smeared, stared up at him with furious eyes. Around his neck hung a pendant bearing the sigil of the Oracle's circle, scorched. Watson hauled him to his feet and cuffed his hands with a spare belt. "You work for Valerius?" The boy said nothing at first. "I know your employer," Watson said grimly, "and I know what he's done. Now, speak, or the river police will make you talk." At last the boy relented. His name was Seb Harker, a stagehand turned courier. He had been paid in gold sovereigns to deliver letters, arrange certain distractions, and, worst of all, help prepare the apparatus that caused Lord Belgrave's death. "He said it had to look like fate," Seb muttered, "like the prophecy was playing itself out. He had me hide the vapour coil under the floor, told me it was just theatre." "And Zuleika?" "She wanted to disappear," Seb said. "Not die, but she started asking too many questions. Valerius said it would be her greatest trick, death as spectacle, a miracle." Watson narrowed his eyes. "And Drebb?" Seb looked down. "I was supposed to deliver something to him next. A candle." Watson froze. "A candle?" "Special wax, something in it. Smelled wrong." Watson did not hesitate. He hauled the boy upright and dragged him toward the door. Back at Baker Street, the air had turned thick with tension. Holmes stood by the hearth, the codex clutched in one hand, the invitation to Drebb's lecture in the other. He turned as Watson entered, with Seb in tow. "Confirmation?" Holmes asked. "More than that," Watson said. "He was the delivery boy for death, and Drebb's next." Holmes exhaled. "The veil shall thin," he murmured again. "No longer prophecy. Performance, every step mirrored, every death echoed." He turned to Seb. "What else?" "I don't know," Seb said. "Only that the candle was to be lit at the climax. Midnight, I think. That's all I know." Holmes looked at Watson. "That candle isn't wax. It's a vapour delivery. Same compound as Belgrave's, but enhanced for a crowd. They don't just want Drebb to die. They want everyone to see it." That night, Holmes worked through until dawn. He wrote out a detailed schematic of the Royal Academy's lecture hall from memory, diagrammed Zuleika's codex next to Valerius's stage notes, and cross-referenced star charts with astronomical bulletins. At 6:15 a.m., as the first milk cart rattled past outside, he looked up. "There's a final reel," he said. "One Zuleika never recorded." "What do you mean?" "She laid out the conditions, the timing, the players, but she left the ending unwritten, by design. She wanted to give the illusion of inevitability while leaving a crack for choice." Holmes stood. "Watson, we interrupt that performance. We don't just save Drebb, we break the narrative." 2 nights later, the Royal Academy buzzed with anticipation. The crowd was eclectic. Scientists, spiritualists, aristocrats and frauds. All had come to see Professor Drebb's final lecture, The Science of the Seen and Unseen. On stage, the setting was minimal. A lectern, a velvet-draped table, a single large candle unlit in a bronze holder. Drebb entered to quiet applause. He looked older, more frail than he had days before, but his voice was calm. "I have spoken before on mirrors," he began, "not those of glass and silver, but of thought, of mind, of what we see reflected back from the world." Behind the curtain, Holmes watched. He had disabled the ignition mechanism in the candle himself, but there was another danger still. Valerius, he was in the audience. Holmes had seen the back of his head, the silver-threaded turban, the straight back, the silence, sitting in row D, perfectly still. As Drebb reached the midpoint of his lecture, Holmes gave the signal. Lestrade, in plain clothes, moved swiftly. Valerius was taken by the shoulders, yanked upright. He did not struggle. He smiled. "Too late," he said softly, but Holmes's eyes caught something, not Valerius's hands. His cane, a button beneath the handle. Holmes knocked it away. The candle did not light, but a panel beneath the stage hissed open. Holmes shouted. Lestrade was already on it. Inside, a reservoir of the same vapour compound used on Belgrave, rigged to release under the floorboards. The trap was complete, and it had failed. Valerius was taken away, his expression unreadable. Later, Holmes stood outside the lecture hall, the wind tugging at his coat. "It was never about murder," he said. "It was about belief. To make them see something impossible, and to believe in it twice, once for Zuleika, and once for Drebb." He lit a match and held it to a shred of the codex. The flame licked the page and turned it to ash. "We end it now," Holmes said, "before someone else rewrites the story." Chapter 8. A Trick of the Light. It was not merely a lecture, it was an event. Outside the Royal Academy of Occult Philosophy, a crowd had already gathered by dusk. Cloaked figures with creaking opera glasses, gaggles of journalists from the Penny Spectre and the Illustrated Occultist, and self-styled mediums wearing obsidian rings and hand-stitched veils. The gas lamps around Bedford Square flickered in the mist, struggling to cut through the fog that clung to the stones like silk morning crepe. Holmes and I arrived an hour early, under the pretense of aiding the organisers. In truth, we were preparing a trap. "I've arranged for the theatre electrician to leave us the key to the lower hatch," Holmes said as we ducked into the backstage corridor. "You recall the reservoir system we discovered beneath the séance table? I believe we'll find something similar tonight, a delivery mechanism hidden underfoot." Inside the hall, Holmes's fingers danced across the edge of the proscenium, searching for a catch. Within minutes he had found it. A false panel beneath the stage, precisely the size and shape to house a concealed gas release chamber. Holmes produced a pocket mirror, angled it downward and peered in. "A twin-valve dispersion pipe," he murmured, "and residue of potassium chlorate along the nozzles. Not explosive, not this time. Hallucinogenic vapour, I suspect. Invisible, scentless. Spread through the footlights to affect everyone in the front 20 rows. Mass hysteria, I said. A shared illusion." "More than that, Watson. A controlled vision. Zuleika's prophecy come alive." He looked up. "Unless we change the ending." The theatre filled swiftly. By 9:30, there was not a seat unclaimed. The guest list was a pageant of London's fractured mind. Professors from Cambridge, exiled Russian mystics, grieving mothers seeking answers in candlelight, and stage magicians who now billed themselves as experiential metaphysicians. Even Lestrade had taken a front-row seat in disguise. A monocle and a theatrical moustache disguising his usually dour face. Holmes was backstage, adjusting the rope and liver system he had rigged to the central candle on the lectern. The trap beneath the stage, now disarmed, remained open to his access via the hatch. He had posted 2 constables beneath the boards, each armed with a net and a chloroform cloth, should Valerius attempt anything physical. I took my seat 3 rows back, close enough to observe but far enough to act. The lights dimmed, a hush fell, the curtain rose. Professor Elgin Drebb stood at the centre of the stage beneath the soft glow of a solitary gas lamp. His expression was composed, though there was a tremble to his hand as he set down his notes. Behind him the banner read, "Science beyond sight, when reason and revelation collide." "My friends," he began, "this evening is not a lecture in the traditional sense. It is an exploration, a descent, not into madness, I hope, but into mystery." A few polite chuckles answered him. He continued, "We are taught to believe that only what is seen, heard, or measured has weight in this world. But might there not be truths too fine, too strange, too delicate for our instruments to catch?" As he spoke, the candle before him flickered once, then again. and then the gaslights in the theatre dimmed. At first we thought it part of the show, but then the room went black. A sharp, audible gasp rippled through the audience. Someone in the gallery let out a nervous laugh, quickly shushed. From the stage came the sound of falling glass, then a thud. Dreb had collapsed. Several people screamed. I leapt to my feet, pushing past the startled woman beside me. Behind the curtain, Holmes moved swiftly. He struck a match, illuminating the base of the lectern. The candle had rolled away, but Dreb, the body on the floor, was breathing. Holmes leaned down and whispered, "Perfect timing, Professor." Dreb gave the faintest nod. "Tonic took effect quicker than expected," he murmured. "Should I remain down?" "Yes," Holmes said, "until I draw the curtain." He turned and darted for the trapdoor hatch. Beneath the stage, the two constables were already holding a third figure, hooded, coughing, half collapsed. One of the constables held up a curved pipe and brass pump, recently dismantled. Another cradled a jar of volatile white powder. "Caught him crawling toward the dispersal line, sir," the older constable said. "Tried to trigger it manually when the blackout hit." Holmes knelt and removed the intruder's hood. It was Valerius, not a disguise. Not this time. His face was stripped of its charm, the smooth magician's smile gone, replaced by a gauntness that aged him 20 years. "You ruined it," he rasped. "It would have been beautiful." Holmes stood. Murder is never beautiful, not even in candlelight. The theatre lights flared again. Dreb had risen, hands raised for silence. "I must apologize," he said, voice steady. "It seems our demonstration was briefly interrupted, but I assure you, this was not spirit interference, merely a trick of the light." Polite laughter. Uneasy. I stepped onto the stage, nodding to Holmes. He faced the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice firm and clear, "you've just witnessed what might have been the third death in a sequence orchestrated not by prophecy, but by theatre." He gestured to the candle. "You were meant to see visions, to hear voices, to believe that the codex was unfolding itself before you." He stepped forward. "But the truth, as always, lies in shadows that do not shift when the lights do." From the audience, a man rose. "The prophecy," he began, "was engineered," Holmes said sharply. "Lines written to align with known celestial events. Symbolism tied to pseudoscience. Deaths made to look miraculous through chemical tampering and timing." He glanced once to the ceiling, and all of it reliant on one thing: your belief. Later that night, as we sat once more in our rooms at Baker Street, Holmes looked exhausted. He had not removed his coat, nor his gloves. He sat with his pipe unlit, staring into the fireplace. "I'm beginning to think," he said at last, "that the next great war will not be fought with armies." I looked up. "No?" He turned. "It will be fought with ideas, with symbols, with people willing to die for myths engineered in parlours by men like Valerius." He held up the final page of the Codex. Burned. Ash. "Zuleika tried to warn them," he said, but in the end her voice was drowned by the spectacle. I stood, crossed to the window. The fog was lifting. Somewhere the stars were still watching. Chapter 9. Embers of Truth. It was just past 4 in the morning when we returned to Scotland Yard. The gas lamps inside flickered like tired eyes. The constables had thinned out, and even Lestrade looked half asleep, perched at the end of a desk with his tie undone and ink smudged on his cuffs. In the holding cell beyond, Valerius sat cross-legged on a wooden bench, eyes closed, hands resting gently in his lap, as though meditating rather than awaiting trial for murder. Holmes didn't wait for permission. He pushed open the iron door and stepped inside. Valerius did not look up. "I knew you'd come," he said quietly. "You're the only one who cares about why." Holmes remained standing, his silhouette tall and sharp in the yellow light. I lingered in the doorway, notebook in hand. "Let's begin, then," Holmes said. "Tell me who was pulling your strings." Valerius opened one eye. It glinted. "You'll like this one, Holmes. The twist is better than most novels." He stretched, cracking his knuckles with an almost theatrical sigh. "It was Zuleika." Holmes tilted his head. "You're lying." "I'm not. You helped forge the prophecy." "No," Valerius said. "I helped stage it. The prophecy. The codex that was all her. I thought it was gibberish, honestly, but she believed it. Every word." He stood slowly, placing his palms flat against the bars. "She came to me months ago, you know. Said she wanted to die, but not really die. Not physically. She wanted to ascend, become myth. a martyr to the idea of truth beyond science. She said if she performed one final miracle, a real one, surrounded by skeptics and believers alike, she could change the tide of reason, reawaken wonder. She wanted to start a movement, I murmured. She called it an awakening. But yes, Valerius nodded. She thought if her death was seen, recorded, discussed, and never disproven, it would seed something unstoppable. Holmes narrowed his eyes. And how were you involved? I helped build the illusion, Valerius said. Smoke, light, chemical triggers. I forged letters to draw the right witnesses. She even had that child actor planted in the audience. Not mute, just skilled at appearing entranced. It was all theatre, Holmes. Beautiful, devastating theatre. And yet, Holmes said, voice quiet, 2 people are dead. Valerius didn't answer. Back on Baker Street, the kettle hissed as Holmes stood unmoving by the hearth, his tea untouched. She believed in it, he said at last, enough to make herself the sacrifice. And yet someone took advantage, I said, used her death as cover for another. Holmes didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened his violin case, not to play, but to retrieve a small tin box nestled beneath the velvet lining. Inside it was the burned scrap of Zuleika's original codex, the first fragment we had recovered from the séance chamber. He laid it beside the newer pages, those decoded and copied from the notebook found beneath the séance table. The handwriting matched, the symbols aligned, but a pattern emerged. The latter pages, Holmes murmured, contain references not present in her earlier work. The metaphor of the veil changes, the symbolism of the second death becomes literal. The ash sigil, that wasn't her. I stepped closer. Then someone altered the codex? Not just altered, rewrote entire passages. He turned to me. There's only one man with the knowledge to decipher the original, and the arrogance to believe he could do it better. We found Professor Elgin Drebb the next day in his private library, nestled behind 2 false bookcases inside the Royal Academy. He looked worn, not from fear, but from guilt. The guilt of a man who knows his deeds have not yet been discovered, but soon will. Holmes didn't bother with pleasantries. You edited her prophecy. Drebb looked up sharply. I don't know what. Holmes stepped forward and laid the codex pages on his desk. You thought if you added your own touches, your own predictions, laced just subtly enough to evade detection, the codex would become yours. The oracle's circle would revere you once more. Drebb's jaw twitched. Zuleika was deluded. She had them all dancing around her like she was some divine mouthpiece. I merely added clarity. You added murder, I said coldly. But Drebb shook his head. I never meant for Belgrave to die. That was someone else. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Then why insert the passage about the second silence? To scare her, Drebb admitted, to make her back down from publishing. I thought if she believed the codex had been corrupted, she'd reconsider. I never imagined she'd go through with it, or that Valerius would play along. He folded his arms. I wanted to stop a fraud, not become complicit in a crime. Holmes considered him for a long moment. Who knew about your edits? No one, Drebb said. I encoded them myself. She never even saw the final copy. Holmes turned away, silent. For once there was no simple villain, only ashes, each carrying a different lie. Back home, Holmes worked late. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the floor. He sat in his chair, the pages of the codex spread around him like a shattered star chart. They all thought they were guiding fate, he said softly. Zuleika, Valerius, Drebb, each playing God with symbols and smoke. I poured him a cup of tea, but only one committed the second murder. Holmes looked up, eyes flaring with sudden clarity. Exactly. He rose, crossed to the window, and looked out across the mist-cloaked rooftops. It wasn't Zuleika. She intended illusion. It wasn't Valerius. He followed her design, however warped. And it wasn't Drebb. His motives were rooted in pride, not blood. He turned. There's a fourth player. And just like that, the embers flared again. Chapter 10. The Dust Remains. It was early evening, and the air in Baker Street had taken on that peculiar heaviness unique to the first days of April, where winter's breath lingered in the stones, and yet the lamps glowed with a whisper of spring. Holmes had not spoken for over an hour. He sat curled in his armchair, coat draped loosely over his frame, his eyes not on the fire but on a single slip of paper laid across the hearthstones. The last line of Zuleika's prophecy, rewritten by Drebb, stared up at him. Open quote, when the veil is lifted and ash falls like snow, only the blind shall see. Close quote. He exhaled through his nose a tired, thoughtful sound and let the silence stretch. I had learned not to fill it. At last he said, "He fooled us, Watson, from the very beginning." I looked up from the telegram I was reading. "Dreb?" Holmes shook his head. "No, the boy, the mute. His name was not on any record. The one we knew as the mute prodigy, the pale, slender figure who shadowed Zuleika at every séance and was assumed to be her ward, had slipped through every net of identification. No census file, no school attendance, no medical history. But Holmes had found a photograph, a faded tintype from 1877, hidden between pages in Zuleika's journal. In it, a much younger Zuleika stood beneath an ivy-covered colonnade, a babe in her arms. The same blue eyes, the same scar at the edge of his left brow. A family resemblance rendered unmistakable by time. He was her son, Holmes said, unacknowledged, hidden away in childhood, and brought back into her act as a silent witness. A prop. I set the telegram down. So why kill her? Holmes leaned forward and picked up the small notebook we had retrieved from behind a false panel in the séance table. It was hand-stitched, filled with what had first appeared to be mystical sigils. "They're not mystical," Holmes said softly. "They're architectural. He was a draftsman, possibly an engineer. The symbols we believed to be spiritual markers, they were repurposed circuit diagrams, chemical schematics. His notes are furious, obsessive, but precise." He turned the book toward me. "Here, beneath the circle of fire. Read it." Scrawled in cramped pencil were the words, "Open quote, the flame is not for belief, the flame is for ending the lie, for cleansing the stage, for letting her go." Close quote. Holmes stood. He didn't want the world to believe in Zuleika, he said. He wanted to free her, and in doing so destroy the performance that had been his prison. It ended, as many of our cases did, not with violence, but with recognition. The boy, or rather the man who had passed as one, was found at the edge of the Thames near Millbank, seated beneath the shadow of a crumbling warehouse, tossing fragments of paper into the water. Lestrade and I approached with caution. Holmes didn't. He walked straight to the man and sat beside him. Neither spoke for several minutes. Only the sound of paper meeting water and the occasional call of gulls above. At last Holmes said, "You weren't her prisoner. Not at the end." The man didn't answer. Holmes continued, "You didn't kill Lord Belgrave for her. You killed him because he tried to claim her, own her." A single nod. "He paid for her stagecraft, expected obedience in return," Holmes said. "He was planning to rewrite the codex, publish it under his own name." The man looked at him. "He told me," he whispered. "Said I was lucky, said I had a front row seat to history. But I knew what he wanted." His hands tightened around the last scrap of paper. "I didn't want history," he said. "I wanted her to rest." Back at Baker Street, Holmes placed the codex, all of it, including the original, into the fireplace. I watched silently as the flames caught, curling the parchment at its edges, the ink warping into unreadable ghosts of language. Somewhere behind us, the city creaked. Holmes stood with his hands behind his back. "No one will know what was real," I said. "They never did," Holmes replied. The flames consumed the last of the manuscript, collapsing into a pile of grey ash. He turned to me, and for a moment his expression was unreadable. Not triumph, not sorrow, merely understanding. He reached into his pocket, removed a single unburned page, the one with Zuleika's original seal, and placed it into an envelope. "For the boy," he said, "he deserves to know not all of her was a performance." And then, quieter, more to himself, open quote, "The greatest trick, my dear fellow, is not belief, but misdirection." Close quote. He turned back to the window, where the fog had begun to lift. Beneath it, the city exhaled, and behind it all, the dust of the oracle settled into silence.
This was Sherlock Holmes and the Ashes of the Oracle, written by Beryl Coops. I hope you enjoyed my short story. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. I have written over 500 short stories over the years under many pen names. I will be updating these and recording them under the Beryl Coops name. I will be listing them on YouTube as fast as we can get them recorded. They will include historical drama, humor, adventure, romance, period drama, mystery, thriller, war stories, spy stories, revenge, horror, psychological horror, dystopian, disaster, children's stories, love stories, and more. Too many to name. Something for everyone. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up. It helps others find my channel. Until next time, thank you for listening to the end.